The life of a princess is supposed to be a devil, may-scared life of fun, fashion, luxury, and influence. And it's been that way for as long as people can remember, even today, when the very few real princesses who exist have virtually no power. People are fascinated by their lives. Growing up, many young girls dream of being a princess, whether real or Disney. Those kids might think twice when they find out about the tragic life of Marie Theresa, Louise Savoy, the Princess de la. For the last time anyone saw the princess, it was to watch her head being paraded through the streets of Paris on a pike. It wasn't glamorous to be a princess in France. In 1792, it was dangerous. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to our channel. By the beginning of September 1792, the French Revolution had been going on for 3 years. Starting as a movement to reform the government of Louis XVI, the absolutist King of France, by 1792 events had moved from reform to complete revolution. In the simplest terms possible, many French had had it with the monarchy, the related nobility, and their place far above the rest of the population in wealth, power, prestige, and their immunity from justice. In pre-revolutionary France, the king and the aristocracy of nobles had all the power. Not most of it, all of it. For example, if a person was run down by the coach of a fast-moving nobleman or woman, their family had no real way to seek justice if, and this was a big, if they should manage to take the nobleman to court, their word counted for virtually nothing and the nobleman's everything. If by the wildest chance the nobleman was found guilty, he would likely have to pay a small fine and then walk out of court, a free man with no lasting consequences. Making things worse was the lifestyle of many nobles. Though many nobles, especially outside of Paris, were in debt and gradually losing their wealth, they still managed a lavish lifestyle. The nobility's wealth was apparent and flaunted, especially in Paris. And of course, at the royal palace of Versailles, just a few miles outside the capital. This had always been the case, but France had not always been going broke, as it was in 1789. In the years leading up to the Revolution, France experienced famine and growing poverty, even though the king and regional nobles did order some relief for the poor. More was needed, and what money was allotted for this often found its way into the hands of corrupt officials, not the people who needed it. Adding insult to injury, the lifestyle of the king, his queen, the hated Austrian Antoinette, and the aristocracy of Versailles was beyond belief. In October 1789, thousands of women from Paris marched on the palace to demand food, lower prices, and justice. It was also believed rightly that Louis was plotting against the changes brought by the revolution, mostly the limits put on his power. Many of the women were so angry that the mob has often been called blood-thirsty. Repeated chants about tearing out and eating the livers of the royal guards were heard. Many in the crowds who wanted to kill the king and queen. But before they killed at least 2 guards and put their heads on pikes, they had to get onto the palace grounds and into the palace itself. When they got onto the grounds and into the palace, many of the people in the crowd became silent, staring open-mouthed and disbelieving the truly unimaginable wealth of the palace and its grounds. It was only when the diehards among them began to yell for blood that they all remembered why they were there as a result of the March King, Louis Marie Antoinette. Their children and most of their courts were taken back to Paris, where they could be kept an eye on. One of the women rounded up with the royal family was Marie Theresa Louise of Savoy, the Princess of Lamballe. Marie Theresa had been in court in Versailles in 1770, had become a favorite of the then princess and queen-in-waiting, Marie Antoinette. On her father's side, she was related to the King of Sardinia. She married Louis Alexander de Bourbon-Conti, whose grandfather had been the illegitimate but legalized son of the famed King Louis XIV. often called the greatest of all French kings, who this put Marie Theresa near the top of the royal and aristocratic food chain, and as the head of the Queen's court, she wielded enormous influence for a time. Maritza was replaced as the Queen's favourite by the Duchess Yonne de Poliac, but kept a position because she was so good at it, and because she lacked ambition. Unlike so many of the other reverse, Marie was satisfied with her position and wealth. She should have been. She was incredibly powerful within the court and quite wealthy in her own rights. Perhaps one of the reasons she seemed content with her position was that she had no children to plan a future for. She had married a much older man, and a man who had died from complications from syphilis just a year or so after their marriage. It's believed that Marie Theresa was unable to have children because of her husband's illness. Princess Lombard was in many ways the exact opposite of Marie Antoinette as well, where Marie Antoinette was seen as an empty-headed, luxury-loving and spoiled foreigner with a penchant for playing make-believe on the palace grounds and in her own small palaces on it. Princess Lombard was seen as relatively serious and adult. Unfortunately, Marie Theresa had become a relatively well-known and hated public figure, and despite keeping a relatively low price, that is for the French nobility, which was not known for its shyness in displaying wealth and power. In 1785, Lombard's name was mentioned in the famous affair of the diamond necklace, which was actually determined to be an attempt by scammers to defraud the Queen of a large sum of money. Though it was eventually revealed that Marie Antoinette had nothing to do with the purchase of the large diamond necklace. She and everyone else mentioned in connection with her were beginning to be seen as nothing but leeches living on the backs of the people, the ones who had to pay the taxes that kept the royal lifestyle going. This only made things worse for Marie Theresa. As far as a public image was concerned, her position in charge of the Queen's court had been eliminated 30 years before, on account of the great expenses it entailed. Marie Antoinette had ordered the position reinstated, and with a salary of 50,000 crowns, more than $500,000 today, when it was suggested that Lombard refused the salary, she refused, saying her rank and the position demanded it. Reformers inside the court and many in Paris were outraged. Lombard was one of the richest people in France. She had immense wealth herself and received her husband's wealth and lands when he died to many in France and Paris. In particular, Princess Lombard was part of the problem. By late spring 1791, the French Revolution had been going on for 2 years. In that time limit had been put on the king's power, and while many in France still wanted a king, it was as a constitutional monarch like that of England. Louis XVI was resistant to these changes, but had no real choice but to accept them. However, by early June, it was becoming clear to Louis, who was not the brightest bulb, that many in Paris and France as a whole were seeking to eliminate the position of the monarchy, and perhaps Louis himself and his family literally. So Louis, Marie Antoinette, and their children disguised themselves and boarded a coach with the intent of making it over the Rhine River and into Austrian-controlled territory, which is part of Germany today. Louis and the Queen had been secretly in contact with other royals in Europe, all of whom suggested he flee, form an army, and be the absolute monarch that he had been with their help. Unfortunately for Louis, some of his had been found as had his plans for escape. There, just under 60 miles from Versailles, the royal coach was stopped and its occupants returned to Paris. The king and queen never saw Versailles again. They were kept under guard at the Tuileries Palace in the centre of the capital. Just over a year later, a rumour spread that the king and queen had been in contact with foreign powers who were planning to send an army to France, reinstate the king to his former place, and overthrow the revolution which had brought him. Men's changes to France. Upon hearing the rumour, thousands of Parisians marched to the Tory to either kill or arrest the royal family. On August 10, 1792, the mob stormed the Tory. It was a bloodbath. Some 200 men and women in the crowd were killed by the guards, who had been put there to both protect the royals and make sure they couldn't escape. It wasn't the crowd that suffered most. However, for about 600 guardsmen, members of the king's bureaucracy and court, and some of the nobles staying with the royal family were killed before he was killed. Louis XVI surrendered himself and his family to the authorities, who had begun to restore order towards the end of the afternoon, though many of the revolutionary crowd had been shot. Most of the 600 killed by them had been hacked to death, for most people in Paris did not own firearms. They did have axes, spears, cleavers, clubs, etc., and they used them to tear the royal defenders apart. But literally, one of the people seized in the assault on the Tory was the Princess de Lamballe. Worse, she didn't have to be there. She had fled France shortly before the royal families attempted to escape the prior year. She did this with the permission and urging of the Queen, who wanted a friend to both get to safety and meet with important foreign royals in an attempt to secure their support for the French monarchy. Princess Lamballe may have been a lot of things, haughty, privileged among them, but she was a loyal friend, and she returned to France as a queen in November 1791 after 5 months in England. Unfortunately for her, her return was viewed suspiciously by the now all-powerful revolutionary government in Paris and by the increasingly radical population of Paris, especially among the lower classes, which acted as a sort of revolutionary army and police force inside the city. Lamballe was suspected of having returned with messages from foreign powers to the king and queen. In the summer of 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia, and it was not going well for the French. The commander of the Austro-Prussian forces was the Duke of Brunswick, a gifted military leader from northern Germany. In July, Brunswick sent a message to the French today, called the Brunswick Manifesto, that threatened bloody and brutal treatment of the Parisian revolutionaries if Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were harmed, in an age when information was spread faster by word, mouth, and in the newspaper. The Duke's threats, extreme as they were, grew in the imaginations of the people of Paris. One of the rumors that spread like wildfire began in the latter part of August that Brunswick and the enemies of the revolution, including the king and queen, had people on the inside the many prisons of Paris and the surrounding area, and even much of the country. The word was that on a given signal, guards of the prisons were going to release thousands of political prisoners, as well as murderers, rapists, and worst of all, forgers. Forgers were particularly hated by the people of Paris, for the people who had moved from coin to paper money, and the currency of the time was amazingly easy to forge. This was particularly to blame for the massive inflation France was experiencing at the time, including the supposed plot against the revolution. At least as far as the rumors went were hundreds of Catholic priests who had been jailed for refusing to take in to the revolution over the church. On September 2nd, a group of prisoners was being transferred from one prison to another. When it was attacked by an armed mob, the prisoners and their guards were, you guessed it, hacked to death. Over the next 4 days, more than 1,200 prisoners were killed. Many of them were led from their cells to a hasty trial by popular tribunals in prison courtyards or nearby public squares. Amazingly enough, despite the high number of deaths, most of those accused of plotting against the revolution or treason, considered one and the same, were let go, found innocent. The court and the accused shouted "Vive la nation" and let go. Those who were found guilty heard conduct them to the abbey, a nearby prison, or let him go. Both these parties were euphemisms for guilty. Take them outside and kill them. At first, many of the executed were killed by shooting, but those in charge believed that it might panic the nearby neighborhoods, making them think that Brunswick's approaching army was in the city. So most were beheaded not by the infamous guillotine that came the next year, but by swords, cleavers, etc. Many people were killed by clubbing, as you can see in many popular etchings of the events. Others had their guts pulled out before their heads were removed. Hundreds of people were killed at various places throughout the city. Blood was everywhere. One of the victims was Princess de Lamballe, who was arrested with 10 others when the king and queen were moved to prison cells nearby the Tuileries Palace. The other 10 people included nobles and 2 servants, but they were all released. Not the Princess de Lamballe. She had a chunk of her head sliced off, and then she was assaulted. While the crowd watched after this, her abdomen was cut open, and her intestines pulled out and displayed it. It was only then that she was decapitated, and her head paraded around on a pike later. Her head was reunited with her body and buried. Lamballe's body was also desecrated. After her death, her private parts were hacked off and displayed for the mob, as were her breasts. It was only after the mob had dispersed that her head was reunited with her body and buried. Word of what happened to one of the most important nobles in France spread like wildfire. Many people were revolted, but believed she deserved. Nonetheless, most revolutionaries believed she got what she deserved as part of the class that had kept the people down for centuries. Royalists in France, who dared not speak out, noble expatriates, as well as foreign monarchs and nobles, were angered by what happened to the Princess de Lamballe and vowed to crush the revolution. Lamballe's death was used as propaganda by both sides. Royalists depicted her almost as a martyred saint, revolutionaries as a spoiled power, Matt Harpy that deserved to die. Her story was used by both sides for the next 100 years. But fiction is sometimes stranger than truth, because though Marie Theresa, Princess de Lamballe, was decapitated like more than 1,000 others during those brutal days, none of those other brutal things happened to her. None of them, though her head was placed on a pike for hours. Word of mouth, rumors and conspiracy theories turned her tragic yet straightforward death into a watchword for both sides, for the revolutionaries. It was long-delayed justice for those against the revolution. It was an example of the excess of the revolutionary mob and a rallying cry for anti-revolutionary nations outside France to restore order. But unfortunately, the September massacres are seen as the first step to what became known as the Reign of Terror, which swept France over the next 2 years and claimed tens of thousands of lives. Thank you for watching. We truly appreciate it. Please like and subscribe for more content like this coming in the near future.